On the night of April 18th, 1775, a Boston silversmith climbed on a horse and changed the course of a nation. One ride, multiple riders, really a network of patriots, and a warning that helped spark the American Revolution. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Kostya Kennedy, best-selling author, former Sports Illustrated senior writer, and the man who's brought us unforgettable portraits of legends such as Joe DiMaggio, Pete Rose, and Jackie Robinson. In his latest book, The Ride, Paul Revere and the Night That Saved America, he takes us back to that fateful night, separating myth from reality, and showing why Paul Revere's ride was not just a poem. It was a pivotal moment that helped save the fledgling American cause. We're talking about the real man behind the legend, the coordinated efforts of other writers like Dawes, and the high stakes drama in the Massachusetts countryside, and what it all means as we celebrate America 250. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. Kostya, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Peter.
So you're known as like the guru of sports history. What brought you to Paul Revere and the ride?
My earlier books, some of them are my baseball books, were clearly baseball books, and I love baseball, but they were also historical. They were all kind of figures and events that slipped outside the bounds of the game. So you like my first book on Joe DiMaggio, it's called 56, and it was about his hitting streak in 1941, but it's also very much about the sort of social history of the time and why that baseball achievement and moment, had such a widespread took such a widespread hold on people. It was the summer right before World War II. They called it the last innocent summer, and he was an Italian American hero, which was a complicated thing to be at that time. I did a book on Jackie Robinson, where I looked at four specific seasons in his life, metaphorical seasons, literal seasons, and obviously the social impact there is clear, and his outside baseball work, and even the book I did on Pete Rose, where there's a real sort of moral conundrum on how to handle forgiveness and things like that. So I just say all this by means of uh, I felt like I was in sports but outside sports at the same time, kind of in my thinking and my book writing. And so a lot of doing this Paul Revere was felt fairly consistent with the kind of reporting and research I'd done earlier. I felt very at home doing it, and the idea just really appealed to me, of this figure at this time.
So maybe you could like paint a picture for us. It's April 1775, I think it was 18th. He's about to mount the horse, right? Can you kind of walk us through that night and essentially really start off with what is it that people mostly get wrong about this night?
Yeah, I think that, people do like to focus on what they got, on things that they got wrong, but in essence, the what we know of the story, the sort of macro version of this rider went out and had a big effect on getting people to come and be ready for the battles of Lexington and Concord, which ensued. As you mentioned, he went out April 18th, and it was at night, and the morning of April 19th and into the day is when the battles of Lexington and Concord took place. So that much is known and is true. One thing I think we should realize is just how critical that his ride was. And there were other riders, and I explore that in my book. There were some were more significant than others, but he was certainly part of a network. He was the progenitor. He was the single most important rider to the whole enterprise. But there were certainly others without which things would have gone differently. But in general, if and this is one of the things that appeals to me so much about Revere, I guess, is he really met the moment. He knew what time it was. He was about 40 years old at that time, and he knew what time it was in his life, and also for this crazy idea of revolution against the British Army, the Royal Forces. And he met that moment in a way that if he had not been successful in his ride and alerting people, and in spreading the alarm of what was happening. And if he and the other people had not been successful, that whole first battle of the American Revolution would have gone very differently and would have had a huge impact, actual impact, physical impact on lives lost, and also on just morale, because this is an audacious thing to take on the best trained, best equipped, most experienced army in the world with a bunch of essentially farmers and without a lot of real firepower. So it would have shaped what happened at Bunker Hill 2 months later, which was the British effectively won that. They held ground, but suffered much greater casualties than the colonists in that battle. And we wouldn't have July 4th, 1776 as our day of independence. I feel certain of that if things had not gone the way they did that night. I don't think we'd still be driving on the wrong side of the road and saying cheerio, but I do think it would have taken a little longer. So I don't know if that's something that people get wrong, so to speak, to not to run away from your question, but I bring that up because it's a thing that I think people don't understand or don't realize um, what how important the ride was. In terms of things that people may or may not get wrong, most people know Revere if they know him. Either they just know the name, they know him from the poem. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. And in that poem, Longfellow certainly takes some liberties with fact, not again, not great liberties, but some of the timing, the fact that he doesn't get into the fact that Revere was actually captured and then got himself free. There's various elements of the ride that, to me, only made it more dramatic. Once you got outside the realm of the poem and into the hard facts. But some of those details for people who might really know the poem or think about what it says, those aren't exactly right.
So if we could look at the men behind the myth, right? Who was Paul Revere? You said he's 40 years old and he decides to do this. Maybe perhaps something about his life that shows us why he would do this. Like, who was this man? A family man? Obviously we know what he did for a living, but maybe paint us a picture of that.
Yeah, so he was, as you mentioned, he was a silversmith. And he was also, and I think this is worth noting, he was, in addition to that, he hustled. So he's also an engraver. He was a self-trained dentist for a while. Not maybe the kind of dentist you would choose to go to, but you took what you could get in 1775. Um, and I point that out just to say that's his character. He was looking to be an industrious person. He was doing fine financially. He ended up having 16 kids, 11 of whom survived into adulthood, so he needed to make a good living. And he was also extremely passionate and committed to this cause. So when he was in his 20s, he joined the Masons, partly as a way to get business for his silversmithing business, to meet people and say, hey, I've got this business on the wharf. And it was there that he met Joseph Warren, who was one of the principal figures in organizing the start of the revolution and the ideas of the revolution in the late 1760s and early 1770s in Boston. Joseph Warren was a critical figure, and he helped to shape um, Revere's thought and to energize Revere. I mean, as I mentioned, he was energetic anyway, but to point his energies in this direction. So he's a very committed sort of political operative who'd been involved in this for some time. Paul Revere and Warren and obviously many others were on the ships at the Boston Tea Party, throwing the tea off the British boats in 1773. And he was also he'd been this was far from his first ride. That's another important thing to remember is that quick, really brief history. In the 1750s or so, if you wanted to send a letter or some kind of message from, say, Boston down to New York, you gave it to somebody and they traveled on a horse and carriage to Sulky and brought the letter down. It took its time. There were stops along the way. Maybe you got a letter back, and weeks later the correspondence would be complete, and so on. Samuel Adams, who was another of the principal uh, conceivers and executors of the early part of the revolution, put in place in the 1760s a series of express riders. And these were single men on horseback when things were getting a little when the British were very prominent in sort of occupying Boston, and they would spread information much more quickly um, about redcoat activity. It could also be about more local political activity or even a health news, but primarily redcoat activity. And Revere was the best they had. He was the single best express rider that they had. And not only because he was good on the back of a horse, but he was really good, Peter, at giving information, meaning that he didn't dilly-dally with it. He knew enough to tell you what had to happen and to be able to answer your reasonable questions. And generally on these kind of rides, he had to keep stuff all in his head. A couple times he had documents, but usually you didn't want to have that because it would be treasonous if you were caught with it. So, for example, Revere, after taking part in the Boston Tea Party in 1773, he was the one who was dispatched to travel down to Hartford, New York, Philadelphia, and say what had happened and give the news. He brought the Suffolk Resolves to the First Continental Congress, he alone in the fall of 74. So this was the man. It's no accident that he was the lead rider and he was the person that Joseph Warren, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and all the rest, but those four sort of main organizers were really counting on the night of the 18th.
Yeah, he was definitely the man suited for the job. You might say he was the superhero of the night. And but as you mentioned, and you talk about it in your book, he has sidekicks, right? And while I think, in your book points this out that there is no argument that he was the superhero of the group, who were these sidekicks? Can you maybe tell us a little bit about them?
Sure. So it's sort of two categories. Well, there was only one other person who actually left from Boston that night. And that was a man named William Dawes, and I have a chapter on him. He was a less prominent writer, but he was a completely committed loyalist, not loyalist, committed colonist to the cause. He's completely loyal to the cause, I guess I should say. And he went out by land off the south side of Boston, and Revere went across the Charles River to get to Charlestown, and that's really where he began his ride. He went out the top of the north end of Boston. Dawes, just for whatever reason, he didn't seem to. He also made. They both were going to Lexington, both Revere and Dawes, where John Hancock and Samuel Adams were staying to warn them. That was the first stop to warn them of what was happening. And Dawes appears to have left earlier, but got there much later than Revere did. And he doesn't appear to have been very successful in alerting anyone. We know that simply because, well, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. People gave testimony. Revere told me, or Revere told this person, told that person. And we didn't hear any of that from about Dawes. And also because when they had sort of the roll call of who was at Lexington and Concord, they didn't really come from the places where Dawes had gone through, but they did from where Revere had gone through. We don't know why that is. Certainly, he was very brave. He both Dawes and Revere could easily have been killed, could have been captured and held. Anything could have happened. But he was a sort of the one other rider who set out from Boston. Then, if you imagine Revere going out from the North End, um, first Revere had asked to have the lanterns hung, one if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore shall be, as the poem goes. These were two lanterns hung because the British were going to cross. That's a bit of a poetic turn to say sea. They were going to also cross the Charles River. So those were hung to give some notice to Charlestown and Cambridge, but just a relatively small area where they could see it. And then when Revere got over to Charlestown, got his horse, and set out towards Lexington, going through places like Medford and Menominee, Arlington, sometimes he would tell somebody, and they would get on their own horse and come, or they'd beg off and say no. Other people would get on their horse and travel further out to towns like Lynn and Reading, so that they were in turn spreading the news. And again, through anecdotal evidence and recorded evidence, we see that there were maybe as many as 30 or 40 riders once you got deep into the night, say 2, 3 in the morning, fanning out across. You can imagine looking from above and seeing the sort of neural network of riders going across meadows and roads. Wasn't as nearly as well cut up into roads as it is today to get the word out. So those were critical figures who made it happen. And when you think about the way things turned out, so the British the next morning arrive at Lexington. There's sort of a soft resistance there, not enough really to stop them. They kind of move through. They get to Concord, which is about another 5 miles down the road. There's greater resistance. More people have arrived now, and so their attempt to in Concord bring in some military stores that were being held there, it's kind of blunted, and they're turned back. And then by the time they're on their way back, they're by at this point, so now it's like say early afternoon-ish on the 19th, there's thousands of colonists along the road just shooting at them, really making them pay. And there's no way you could have that number of people with a single rider, no matter how good at his job he was. So it needed people to go out. And some of those people were part of this express rider network or local militias, and some were just, in one case, at least two cases actually, a doctor who was out, visiting somebody or doing a round, or somebody else at a tavern who was there and was just aware of the mission and the cause and took it upon themselves to go out. There was no such thing at that time as the Continental Army. There were local militias. There were certainly some organized forces, but it wasn't as fully organized as one might think if you think about a military establishment.
Do you think we owe it to Longfellow to say that he made Paul Revere into who he is in the American, annals of history? Or was Paul Revere already famous during his lifetime? Or we really have to say like, no, like Longfellow probably made him into who he is.
Yeah, I think it maybe split the difference a little bit. I think for the larger public, it's fair to say that Longfellow, the reason my book happened, the reason why there's in Guides and Dolls, you got the horse right here. His name is Paul Revere. The reason we have, Paul Revere song by the Beastie Boys or by Noah Kahn, and the reason why everybody knows the name Paul Revere is because of Longfellow's poem. There's no question that vaulted him when he wrote that poem. And Longfellow he wrote the Ride, as we've said, is 1775. Longfellow writes the poem in 1860. It's published in 1861 in the Atlantic. So that's 85 years later. Longfellow is writing it as sort of a call to um, rise up against, as an abolitionist, to rise up and against slavery. And, Longfellow at that time was a time when poets were in certain esteem, and he was the best known, best paid poet in the world. He'd written Song of Hiawatha, he'd written Evangeline. When he wrote a poem such as this, people noticed and responded. So, in that sense, yes, there's no question that Revere the pop culture Revere is thanks to Longfellow. That said, you or I or somebody else who happened to be a scholar of American history, and not even like a committed scholar, but somebody who read about that time and cared about that time, would almost certainly have known who Paul Revere was. It was documented. So he was part of the network. He'd be a figure like many others who people who study that time would know. And it's also the case that, I mean, the reason that one of the reasons that Longfellow even wrote about him, and that he'd read an account Longfellow had years before of Revere's ride in a magazine. So he was out there, right? Revere's own account. He read a first-person account of it, and that's part of what years later inspired him to write it. So he would certainly know, and again, to some degree known. So it wasn't a sort of, you know, Longfellow pouring through some old documents and coming, oh, look at this guy I write a poem about. No, he was known, and at the time, the name Paul Revere among knowledgeable circles, certainly in Massachusetts and around there, absolutely knew who Revere was. So it's sort of somewhere in the middle between certainly not a pop culture immediate name, but also not completely obscure either.
So I always ask this question of my guests and authors. Did you have this like aha or wow moment where you kind of turned from being a historian researcher to just being like a history geek? You're doing this research and you're like, oh, this is so cool. Did you have any of these moments?
Yeah, I think that the couple that I could tell you, it's a wonderful question. It's part of, and I'm sure you know this too. It's part of the treat of doing this, right? Of sort of being an archaeologist in some sense, right? One of the things that I sort of realized, which I hadn't realized going in, is how, I mentioned these four other men, Samuel and John Adams, Hancock and Warren, and others, but these were all guys who like went to Boston Latin or Roxbury Latin for school, then they went to Harvard. They were of a certain class. They'd had their families had been there for a long time since the middle of the 1600s. And Revere, who'd come as an immigrant, his father came as an immigrant in 1715, and the French-speaking immigrant. He went to what was called writing school, it's kind of a trade school. He certainly wasn't going to go to college. And he was sort of an everyday, certainly very intelligent and very disciplined, but an everyday and sort of class sense person who elevated so close to the sort of upper crust, right? Something that America was trying to shed at that point philosophically, but was still very much in place. Everybody with the British system here, of course. That was kind of interesting, right? And just realizing he's the kind of blue collar guy, right, who went out and did it. He was the most trusted plumber, kind of, you know. So that was good. And then I had different moments. Both reporting and researching, you try to bring these books to life as much as you can. And simple things like being in the Massachusetts Historical Society and asking for a newspaper from 1775, and out comes this broadsheet, incredibly dense, tiny type. You have to use white cotton gloves even to handle it. It's been somewhat treated, but not much. It just feels like, and you see this paper was on the streets of Boston 250 years ago, right? And it got some news of redcoat activity, and then it had the little box which says 5 heifers for sale in Somerville, right? It's this active, breathing, working document, and you realize like life was going on, right, at that time. And a big part of what I tried to show a little bit was just how that life was going on and what was happening in the world at that time. It wasn't that everybody woke up every day and started thinking about the British. People woke up and thought about, what am I going to do about my crop? What am I going to do about my life? All of that. So there were those kind of. I had some great moments on with the timbers of an old ship that was part of that time, which I found up in Massachusetts. I climbed to the top of the Old North Church. There was some real moments of feeling like you were getting close to it and realizing, as of course we realize. So when I say realize, it's more like that moment of epiphany, small epiphany that we all have, even just in outside of researching, of how, these were real people who really lived, who maybe his foot hurt that day or whatever. It's Paul Revere, it's not Paul Bunyan, right? It's not Odysseus from the Odyssey, right? It's an actual figure who lived and executed. So yeah, and it was full of little treasures like that. That's just a little touch of what it was like.
That's awesome. I can't recommend the book enough. I received it as a gift from my kids because they're like, well, Dad likes history. So, you got the teenagers to look at the cover and read the back and be like, oh, my dad would like this. And they were not wrong. So,
Oh, that's
great
great.
book. I really can't recommend it more. And Kostya, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Peter, I really enjoyed it, and thanks for the great question, and thanks to your kids for getting us together, so to speak.